This video is brought to you by PrizePicks. Whenever the Browns do something that makes national headlines, whether it's positive or negative, it's like people reach out to people who might have a gripe with the Browns to talk to them finally nationally, and that's when those people want to talk with the Browns. I bring that up because Jim Schwartz talked on some show. I don't know what show it is. It says hashtag RRS in the corner, but credit to that show. They had Jim Schwartz on, and Jim Schwartz, for the first time, talked about why he left the Browns, what his thought process was for leaving the Cleveland Browns. So let's jump into this video and hear what Jim Schwartz has to say, his perspective on why he left.
Yeah, I mean, it sort of is what it was. We had a lot of success. Yeah, I mean, it sort of is what it was. We had a lot of success on defense, and the Browns made a change at head coach, and they passed over me with all the success that we had and the ability that to develop players. Our best players had their best years, all those different things. And that was the decision they made. They wanted to go with an offensive guy. They chose Todd. I'm fine with that. They can make, decisions that they want to make, but they can't expect me to stay on board for that. Anybody that's in any business, you get passed over for a promotion when you've done a really, really good job in your job, and you think you were in line for that promotion. It's time to go. And Todd deserved his own guy. He doesn't. I mean, a forced marriage isn't going to work in the NFL.
So far, I don't really have a problem with anything that Jim has said so far. He does sound like he felt like he was a little entitled to the head coaching position, which I do find a little bit confusing here, given that there wasn't much smoke about Jim Schwartz getting other head coaching jobs. But maybe in Jim Schwartz's mind, he's saying to himself, I've worked really hard here. If anybody's going to reward me and give me a head coaching job, it's going to be here because that's where I've done the work. But that's not really how jobs tend to work. People get hired based on what that organization needs at that point. And the reality is that the Browns didn't need a defensive-minded head coach when the job came open. That's not why the job came open. Kevin Stefanski got fired because of the offensive performance of the Cleveland Browns. He didn't get fired because the defenses weren't good. He got fired because of the offensive performance. And if you're going to fire somebody for their lack of offensive performance, the person you hire has to be able to provide a good answer for that. And nothing I've heard about Jim Schwartz as far as what's been leaked to what he wanted to do as a head coach or what he says in this interview suggests to me that he had a good answer to that question, right? Because again, the Browns weren't looking for a new head coach just for shits and giggles. The Browns were looking for a new head coach because they needed to fix the offense. So Jim Schwartz, I think a good question to ask him is, okay, Jim, how would you have fixed the offense? You think that you should have had the job. You think that you're qualified for the job, and all that's true. You were at least qualified for the job, and you have an argument for getting the job. But if you can't provide a good answer for how you're going to fix the offense, then you're not going to solve the problem that got Kevin fired in the first place. Now, as far as arranged marriages and all of those things, that's hilarious for Jim Schwartz to say, to be honest with you, because he said, let's roll the clip back here, right? What's he say exactly? I want to make sure I get him exactly, because there's something that obviously contradicts that I don't think people are thinking of.
Time for that promotion. It's it's time to go. And Todd deserved his own guy. He doesn't. I mean, a forced marriage isn't going to work in the NFL. And
okay, so Jim Schwartz's word here is that a forced marriage doesn't work in the NFL, which that's not a crazy opinion, right? A lot of people have that opinion. I think it's crazy for Jim Schwartz to say that because wasn't Jim Schwartz a forced marriage to Kevin Stefanski? Kevin Stefanski did not hire Jim Schwartz when he had to fire Joe Woods. It was Andrew Berry that hired Jim Schwartz. It was the connections that Jim Schwartz had through Philadelphia through Andrew Berry that got him the job in Cleveland. So on one hand, Jim Schwartz, in his mind, right, to justify his exit in Cleveland, is saying, oh man, you can't do a forced marriage. But we just saw you operate in a forced marriage the last 2 years and you were fine with it. You made the argument that that was a good thing when you got hired. That you could bring because you're not from Stefanski's web of defensive minds, that you could bring a different perspective. I remember those press conferences. Now all of a sudden forced marriages can't work. It's like, are we being honest here, Jim? You didn't get the job. You didn't want to work there. I can understand that perspective, right? I can understand. I talked about this when people were assuming that Jim was simply going to be defensive coordinator if the Browns went a different direction and hired somebody else. And I made the point of like the same point that Jim Schwartz is making. If you feel like you're up for a promotion, you can't get that promotion, and somebody else gets that promotion and you think you should have got it, a lot of people quit their jobs at that point. I don't blame Jim for that. You know what I mean? But if you're going to tell me that you don't think arranged marriages can work in the NFL, you got to explain how you worked with Kevin Stefanski the last 3 years. Because that certainly was not Kevin's choice. Like, that's interesting, right?
Like having command of the players and having command of the locker room, all those things are extremely important. And I didn't feel like I could do my job after getting passed over for the head coaching job. It sort of, just put me in a tough position. Hey, we want you to listen to this guy, but we didn't think, we didn't want to make him the head coach. So I made the decision to resign, and I have to sit out this year as a result. But
what? Okay, yeah, because he's under contract, right? That's why he's okay. Right. We'll get back to that. I will run that back.
I think anybody that's been in any business, when you've done a good job, when you mentioned those numbers, we weren't one of the best defenses in 3 years. We were the best defense in 3 years.
All right. So he said a couple of things interesting here, right? I think some of them true, some of them a little bit funny.
Just put me in a tough position. Hey, we want you to listen to this guy, but we didn't think, we didn't want to make him the head coach.
So his point is, after they passed me up, he felt like he was embarrassed. That's what he's saying. That's the subtext of what he's saying. I think it's fair to imply that, right? The reason he felt like he couldn't do his job as defensive coordinator, according to words that Jim Schwartz is saying, is because he got passed up as head coach and now he's still defensive coordinator. And he felt like that was embarrassing. There's another additional layer of subtext there that you got to kind of consider, which is if you felt like it was embarrassing that you didn't get the job over Todd Monken, it must mean that you did not have that high of an opinion of Todd Monken, that you felt like that's somebody that's worthy of leapfrogging you for the Browns head coaching job. Now, me personally, I think this is bullshit from Jim Schwartz. Like the idea that he's trying to sell us, that he couldn't possibly get the defensive coordinator, to get the defense to listen to him when they've listened to him for the last 3-4 years because the team didn't hire him because they were looking for an offensive-minded coach. Like, that's bullshit. They would have listened to him. He could have came back, been the defensive coordinator. Like he's trying to make it seem like he had no choice other than quit. And like, I don't get why he's doing all of this. I don't think his decision to quit is unreasonable. I think he should just stand on it. He didn't get the job. He thought he should get the job. And, he was really, he wants to go somewhere where he sees a upward level trajectory for himself, and Cleveland made it clear that that's not going to happen here, so I left. What's wrong with saying that? But like trying to sell me on this idea that, I couldn't possibly take the job back because arranged marriages don't work, even though I just came from one. And how could I take the job after being passed up to be a head coach, even though Jim Schwartz himself is somebody who publicly failed as a head coach prior to being the defensive coordinator of the Cleveland Browns? Like, if by his logic, why did anybody listen to him in 2023 when the last time he was a head coach, the team sucked, right? The Lions were terrible when he was a coach. So why listen to him? It's because that's not how the NFL works, right? That's not how players think of it. And Jim Schwartz knows it. And that's why I'm calling bullshit on that whole thing. I'm not upset at Jim or anything like that. I just think what he's saying here is kind of bullshit. But we're going to continue. But first, I got to thank my sponsor, PrizePicks. PrizePicks is a fun way to earn cash while you watch your favorite teams. No complex betting rules. Just pick more or less on a few player stats and lock in your lineup. Here are my picks for this upcoming season, AFC North edition. Jimmy Bernard, I have less than 475. This has to do with volume available in Pittsburgh's offense. Quincy Judkins, I have over 975. Browns improved line. I think the run game is going to be better with it. Chase Brown, under 900 yards. Joe Burrow equals less rushing yards usually for the Bengals offense. Mark Andrews, more than 475 yards. Lamar's going to need a safety blanket. Check to see if PrizePicks is available in your state. You could follow me on the app at Quinn_C to see all my lineups. Download the PrizePicks app today. Play $5 and get $50 in lineup to download the app using the link in the description. All right, let's get back. I think this is a very interesting segment from Jim Schwartz. And look, the one thing you got to give Jim Schwartz credit for, he was always entertaining. You know what I mean? In one way or the other. And he is right. You know, he's talking a lot in this interview about the success that they had. Jim Schwartz was a part of that. I do think sometimes people overblow the level of work that was needed for the Browns defense to be good. I mean, even at the time, we were acknowledging that this defense is good as a roster. We just need somebody to come in, care about the defensive tackle position, and, you know, let Myles Garrett rush the passer. You know what I mean? It didn't take a rocket scientist. I remember like when we were talking about this job opening that they didn't need a rocket scientist or a genius to fix this defense. And Jim Schwartz was exactly that. He wasn't a rocket scientist. He wasn't somebody who was going to try to be a genius. He was just a smart enough man to know that simple was the right answer. And that's ultimately what the Browns did. Something very simple, not complex, and just let their talent speak for itself. Now, without Myles Garrett, that job is dramatically different. So, you know, I do think moving on from Jim Schwartz might end up being the right call, because now we're going to need somebody who's a bit more of a genius to run this defense, because now we don't have the cheat code of Myles Garrett, which is something to think about. Like, imagine if you were stuck with Jim Schwartz as your head coach and Myles Garrett gets traded. I mean, nobody would be feeling any level of decent right now.
So I made the decision to resign, you know, and I have to sit out this year as a result. But, you know, I think anybody that's been in any business, when, you know, you've done a good job, when you mentioned those numbers, we weren't one of the best defenses in 3 years. We were the best defense in 3 years. And, you know, the decision they made, that's their decision. But to expect me to stay and to be on board for that, that's just a tough situation. And it wouldn't have been good for me, and it wouldn't have been good for Todd. So it was best for him to get his own guy in there and to move forward with him, as opposed to just having an arranged marriage and having me there and maybe having some players more loyal to me than him. It can just be a bad situation. 33 years in the NFL. I'd never been around that before.
Now,
So, you know, that all went into decision. I wasn't upset about it. I was disappointed about it. I wasn't upset about it. I wasn't mad about it, but it's just, you know, my experience told me that wasn't going to be a situation that was going to work.
now, Jim, there have been multiple confirmed reports that you stormed out, cleared your office within minutes of finding out you didn't get that job. Like, I think you were a little upset. Like, I think the evidence points to you being a little upset. You know what I mean? And that's okay. I think it's fine that Jim Schwartz was mad. I don't get why he's trying to act like it didn't bother him that he didn't get the job. It's fine. It would bother me too. And honestly, if I were in Jim Schwartz's position, I would have made the same decision he did, right? You know what I mean? If I didn't get the job, they wanted me to stay as defensive coordinator. I'm not interested in doing that. I want to go somewhere where I could be a head coach eventually. Obviously, you don't see me that way. You know, I'll make my move. You know what I mean? And if I was mad, I think that's fair to be mad about that. Now, here's the one issue I've heard people take with Jim Schwartz in this interview, is that Jim Schwartz is kind of making it sound like, in some people's opinion, that he was responsible for all the success on the defense. And I don't think that's necessarily true, right? And there's some people do talk about Jim Schwartz that way, and I don't think that's true. I think that he had a great staff underneath him. Some of those coaches were here when Jim Schwartz got here, hashtag arranged marriage, right? Jason Tarver was here when Jim Schwartz got here, but, Jim Schwartz kept him on despite the fact that he could have loyalty to somebody else on the coaching staff. Again, the arranged marriage didn't bother him when it benefited him, but it's suddenly like that part of it bothers him. We know what part of it actually bothers Jim and what parts he's saying to kind of justify leaving. I don't think he has to justify it, though. I think it's fine that he wanted to leave. All that being said, yeah, I think the Browns were right to move on from Jim Schwartz. Obviously, he was not in the right headspace to be the defensive coordinator of this team after he did not get the head coaching job. He's made that very clear in this interview that that's not something he was interested in, and he's made it very clear with how he's acted that that's not something he would have been right for. And the Browns moved on. They got Mike Rutenberg. We'll see how that works out. Mike Rutenberg seems to have a lot of positive reviews from people who have worked with him in the past. A lot of people think highly of Mike Rutenberg. And face it now, we're in a completely different era of football now that we don't have Myles Garrett. And the simplicity of how that defense was ran with Jim Schwartz, just man coverage, we're going to rush for and dominate. I don't know if that philosophy is going to be able to work without adjustment in the same way that it worked because we had Myles Garrett. Now that we don't have Myles Garrett, we might need somebody there that's being willing to be more custom with what we run in the back end and disguise things a bit more and run things that are a bit more complex. So all in all, I think it had to happen when it happened because I don't think Jim Schwartz staying keeps Myles Garrett here. Again, watch my video about Andrew Berry's press conference, but Andrew Berry made it very clear that Myles Garrett is traded because the Rams offered Jared Verse. And whether Jim Schwartz is the head coach or not, if the Rams offer Jared Verse, Myles Garrett is a Ram. So Jim Schwartz the coach or not, Myles Garrett was going to get traded because the Rams were always going to offer Jared Verse once it came down to the time to make the deal. So imagine being in a situation where the whole reason you're promoting Jim Schwartz the head coach is because of the amazing job he did getting the most of Myles Garrett, and then you trade Myles Garrett, and all of a sudden the defense that Jim Schwartz runs and the defense that he's been pretty resistant to making more complex and to making adjustments to, all of a sudden it's not going to be able to work the same way because the centerpiece of it just got moved out. I think, the Browns ended up making the right move. I understand Jim's frustration. I get why Jim made the decisions he did, and I don't think Jim is wrong for that. I do wish Jim was a little bit more honest about why it is he's making these moves here. But all that's really small shit in the grand scheme of things. I hope Jim Schwartz the best. I hope he goes somewhere. He could become somebody's forever defensive coordinator, or maybe even gets another head coaching job and he rules. Maybe he goes to college. I think Jim Schwartz would rule in college, especially like a good Power 5 school. So I hope him the best in success and hope he finds what he's looking for. But yeah, Browns moved on. If we're looking at this from the perspective of what we know right now, I can really understand that decision. We'll see if it's the right move. We'll see if Mike Rutenberg's going to be good enough to justify that. But I can understand why they made that move, and especially now more than ever.